Neoliberalism has become a new normal. In my part of the world, its influence has been powerful and almost complete. Few question its truth or even know that it can be questioned. In fact, there is this famous photo of Margaret Thatcher saying there's no alternative. And the South Africans came up with this statement, Tina and Temba. So Tina said there is no alternative. And Temba, which is a popular South African name, basically was saying, there has to be another way. So I just thought I'd share that at this point. So while the term neoliberalism may not always be used or understood, aspects of it referred to as globalization, global economic restructuring, etc., capture some notions. And in fact, I've been told that using the word neoliberalism sounds very academic and actually alienates my audience. But I feel that it's important for you to have a deep understanding of what it is. Now, neoliberalism is a contemporary version of liberalism in that it is a it is kind of a more extreme version of basic liberalism that exists in most liberal democracies. The origins of liberalism, as you all probably know, is identified with the work of Adam Smith and his book, The Wealth of Nations. And we could summarize some of its key tenets as the rights of individuals, which probably supersedes community rights, freedom of choice, the moral authority of citizens, political liberalism to choose their government, and economic liberalism, the free market, the primacy of the market to make rational economic decisions without interference or regulation. Now, the emergence of neoliberalism is usually dated to the late 1970s and the period of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. And these policies replaced the Keynesian and social democratic approaches that had been in place in most countries since World War II, where states accepted a responsibility for the poor and the vulnerable and for employment provision and regulated the functioning of the market. Since that time, David Harvey has observed state after state, from the new ones that emerged from the collapse of the Soviet Union to the old style social democracies and welfare states such as New Zealand and Sweden, have embraced, sometimes voluntarily and sometimes in response to coercive pressures, some version of neoliberal theory and adjusted at least some of their policies and practices accordingly. Post-apartheid South Africa quickly adopted the neoliberal frame, and even contemporary China appears to be headed in that direction. Now, the situation of South Africa was particularly sad, as coming out of decades of apartheid, where the African populations were so marginalized, exploited, not educated, totally left out of everything. In the first 2 to 3 years, there was a theme. Their theme was reconstruction with development, which recognized that there was a lot of work that was necessary to reconstruct the new South Africa. But within a few years and the impact of global neoliberalism, that theme changed to reconstruction with growth. And that was the beginning of the end. In other words, a lot of the policies that aimed at redress were never instituted. So South Africa today continues to be a country with some of the greatest inequalities. And what was most unfortunate is that as some of the Blacks stepped into the positions of the whites, for example, on boards of big companies like the Bears, etc., you also had a small group becoming wealthy in a relatively small period of time, because this is what neoliberalism does. It concentrates wealth in the hands of a few. And therefore, at one time, South Africa had the fastest growth of millionaires in the world, while the majority of the South African population continued to be in situations of extreme deprivation. Now, the policies implemented as part of neoliberalism are usually referred to as the Washington Consensus, but I think you may have discussed that in reading the paper. But what we do know is that its main strategies were privatization of all aspects of economic life, social life, cutbacks in social spending, for example, health, education, and social services, and the reduction in the role of the state, except to support private accumulation of wealth, tax reform, reducing the tax burden, especially on the wealthy, deregulation, easing barriers for operation of the private sector and for business to enter and exit, labor market flexibility, removal of fixed labor contracts, local subsidies, price controls, including rent controls, and benefits, which would have, and all labor benefits, and the shift to short-term precarious work. There's also trade liberalization, of course, free trade and free markets. And this was especially imposed on those of us in the global south who could no longer protect our local markets and have been flooded with cheaper imports. A focus on the individualism and the right to individual identities and on individual success, and a reduction in social responsibility and group solidarities, collective action, and corporate activities, and a shift from a focus on social justice to one on charity and helping the poor. The first time I heard some of my students say they were doing charity, I said, what? I hadn't heard that word for at least 3 decades. And all of a sudden, it was there again. We also have what I refer to as the decline in the significance of the social, i.e., social meaning things related to people and society. And this is reflected, for example, in the fact that sociology as a discipline has been declining in many parts of the world, and even social work as a discipline. Although these, of course, could be open to critiques and a lot of change. But it means, therefore, that the social as a component part of life has been really devalued over the last few decades. But neoliberalism has not been only economic, and I think this has been one of the errors of some people. It has been supremely ideological. And this shift has been accompanied by changes in popular consciousness and the mainstreaming of neoliberal thinking. James Carr notes in addition to neoliberalism from above, there's also neoliberalism from below, where popular media, educational programs in schools and universities, popular culture, especially US popular culture, which is beamed throughout the world. And of course, within academia, as I mentioned, the marginalization of programs based on society and social change, lower student numbers, decreased funding, etc. Even women and gender studies programs, and of course, critical race theory, Black and Africana studies in the US also affected by this shift in the concern with the social. This notion of free market and free competition has also supported the idea of post-racialism or post-race, which relegates race and experiences of racism to the private sphere of individual responsibility. In the context of hard work, the hard work and competitiveness required for success in a neoliberal world, this shifts the responsibility for racial inequality away from society and the state to the individual. CAR also refers to the process of racial neoliberalizing project, when northern countries and institutions seek to bring neoliberalism to countries in the global south in a way that is reminiscent of colonial attempts at modernization of colonial countries. Now, the impact of these strategies, I think you all have discussed that a lot in my paper. I did a lot on the impact in the Caribbean, etc., etc., and the critiques that Caribbean feminists have put to these strategies and policies. However, I think what is less known is the fact that the effects has also been extremely significant in the global north. In Japan, for example, according to a 2012 survey, 16% of children are living below the poverty line, the highest on record. In a 2013 livelihood survey found that 51.2% of the elderly requiring nursing care shared households with similarly aged caregivers, 65 or older in 2013, while over 16% of all persons living in poverty, while there were over 16% of all persons living in poverty. Similarly, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, some of you may not know of such a position, but it does exist. In their report of the United States in 2019, found that about 40 million live in poverty, 18.5 million in extreme poverty, and 5.3 million in third world conditions of absolute poverty. It has the highest poverty rate in the OECD, and I have a definition of the OECD, but you can also look it up. That's about 13 countries, began with countries in Europe, but have now expanded to a few countries in Latin America, Mexico, Korea, Israel, Australia, and New Zealand. So it's a strange grouping. And the highest infant mortality rates among comparable states. Its citizens, these are US citizens, live shorter and sicker lives compared to those living in all other rich democracies. Eradicable tropical diseases are increasingly prevalent, and it has the world's highest incarceration rate and one of the lowest voter registrations among OECD countries, and the highest obesity levels in the developed world. Of course, we know who the majority of the incarcerated are, and the US under this neoliberal period also privatized the prisons, moving Angela Davis to coin the term the prison industrial complex, where private firms acquire wealth through the incarceration of primarily African American and other minority men. The report concluded there is thus a dramatic contrast between the immense wealth of the few and the squalor and deprivation in which vast numbers of Americans exist. For almost 5 decades, that covers most of the neoliberal period, the overall policy response has been neglectful at best, but policies pursued over the past year seem deliberately designed to remove basic protections from the poorest, punish those who are not in employment, and make even basic healthcare into a privilege to be earned rather than a right of citizenship. It's of course debatable whether the current administration is shifting this policy, but that's for another discussion. Similarly, in 2019, this special rapporteur reported on the United Kingdom and the impact of the neoliberal policies on that country. And he observed, it thus seems patently unjust and contrary to British values, that so many people are living in poverty. This is obvious to anyone who opens their eyes to see the immense growth in food banks and queues waiting outside them. The people sleeping rough in the streets, that's a very British term, a rough sleeper. The growth of homelessness, the sense of deep despair that leads even the government to appoint a minister for suicide prevention, and civil society to report in depth of unheard of levels of loneliness and isolation. And local authorities, especially in England, which perform vital roles in providing a real social safety net, have been gutted by a series of government policies. Libraries have closed in record numbers. Community and youth centers have been shrunk and underfunded. Public spaces and buildings, including parks and recreation centers, have been sold off. Not surprisingly, therefore, Shara Razavi could conclude, in the last 2, probably 3 to 4 decades, public policies have reflected a drive for accelerated global integration associated with greater economic liberalization. The outcomes have been largely disappointing. Even in the estimation of their designers, rural livelihoods have become more insecure and the expected growth has rarely materialized. The late Jamaican social anthropologist and men's studies scholar Barry Shavans expressed his frustration at the negative impacts of neoliberalism on male youth in the Caribbean. And he could be referring to a number of factors, including the influence of globalized images and musical representations of male violence, in particular Black male violence, the proliferation of small arms and light weapons through the globalized drug trade and arms trade, the pressure to enact a hard, heterosexist, and sexually predatory masculinity through visible access to women in an openly homophobic popular cultural context, and the imperative to demonstrate the trappings of wealth and success through bling and brands. And I think in my presentation, we already read a lot about the violence and about the narco industries, etc. Now, Wesley Critchlow speaks of the weaponization and prisonization of Black male youth in urban communities in Canada, where Black youth's masculinity is embedded within the state's structural violence in the form of marginalization, repression, dehumanization, demonization, vilification, exploitation, and other forms of discrimination. In Punishing the Poor, Lord Raquand argued that the ascent of the penal state in the United States and other advanced societies over the past quarter century is a response to rising social insecurity, not criminal insecurity, that changes in welfare and justice policies are interlinked, as restricted workfare and expansive prison fare are coupled into the single organizational contraption to discipline the precarious factions of the post-industrial working class. Basically, what he's saying is that the conditions of the post-industrial working class have really been gutted and made precarious, and the prison system has been the other side of that process. Now, Derek Hamilton also notes that the increase in incarceration rates in the US, supported by the war on drugs, coincided with the emergence of neoliberalism with its mantra of personal responsibility. In other words, Black males, 50% of the US prison population, although 6% of the US population, were seen as personally responsible for their situation and not the society, its racist policies and systems, nor the neoliberal strategies, which cause major deterioration in the living conditions of the poor African Americans, Latinx, and people of color. Neoliberalism is also characterized by what I refer to as ideologies of, oh, sorry. Okay, sorry, I have to give up on that. Right, and ideologies of entrepreneurship and success. It peddles the myth that prosperity and success is in the reach of everyone, if only you would work hard. But success is only measured in one way, wealth, and its conspicuous consumption. Lack of wealth or the appearance of this is seen as individual failure or group failure in the case of racialized or stigmatized groups. In Trinidad and Tobago, in the Trinidad and Tobago context, for example, of ethnic and racialized competition, those ethnic groups that have acquired wealth through private enterprise, including historically trading minorities and others, are valorized and heralded, although privately resented. They are perceived as more successful and more valuable than others who perhaps work as teachers, doctors, nurses, or public servants for less pay. There has therefore been a shift in the meaning of success and value among young people and others, believing that wealth and its personal visibility is the only form of group and personal success. And a scan through the media and an examination of the so-called celebrities, I think, will support this. Yet, this new emphasis on individual enterprise and hard work as the basis for economic success is not borne out by the data. Derek Hamilton found that that evidence from the US decennial census reveals that between the period from 1940 to 1980, the earnings of a typical Black man, and you have to understand in 1940, they didn't collect such data about women. So in 1940, the typical Black man earned 45% of the typical white male earnings. So by the 1980 census, when neoliberalism is now getting into beginning in earnest, that gap was reduced by 1930. That gap was reduced to about 70% of the average white male wages. But after 1980, that process of improvement stopped. The explanations for this, not the explanations for the shift since the 1970s, usually focus on weak education, lack of hard work, poor individual attitudes. The presumption is that if Black people were more responsible, made better financial decisions, and focused on education, they would have a good job and achieve economic security. But Hamilton goes on to cite a 2015 report, which found that in the US, Black households in which the head graduated from college have less wealth than white households in which the head dropped out of high school. So the ideology of individual wealth as success, therefore, has shifted values of what is good and valuable, and also demonized the social democratic and welfare state. Oh, sorry, totally mixed up my slides. Demonized the social democratic and social welfare state in ways, for example, referring to it as the nanny state. In other words, when people call on the state to take care of the people who voted for it, the state can be accused of being the nanny state because individuals are supposed to have responsibility over their own lives. And this devaluation of the social democratic and welfare state takes place alongside the overvaluing of business, so-called entrepreneurship, and the private sector. I must state here that in my own work, I've done a lot of criticism of the social welfare state in Britain, and in the Caribbean, but I'm looking now at its general overall role. State responsibility for social protection and employment provision is now shifted under individuals, including the poor, who are peddled with the myth that everyone can now become a wealthy entrepreneur if they would only believe in themselves and work hard. And this reduces state responsibility to take care of its citizens. Relatedly, a culture of bling, brands, and hypersexuality has emerged among the most marginalized Black and economically disadvantaged youth, female and male, who must have access to the most expensive consumer items, or at least things that look like them. For example, sneakers, gold jewelry, weaves, wigs, luxury cars, brand name clothing, high cost alcohol, for example, vodka, brandy, and whiskey. When I was teaching at university in the student activities, you didn't see rum anymore. It was high level brandy, whiskey, and vodka. I don't know where they got the money to buy items which they often cannot afford, but which provide the necessary representations of wealth and success that are required. A major shift has also occurred within fundamentalist Christianity over the period, described as the gospel of prosperity. This new approach emerged largely among conservative Southern US-based theological traditions and taken up by important sections of the Black church in the US. Now, like all of you, under COVID, I spent some time on Netflix and was looking at that series, Green Leaf. I don't know if anybody else saw it, but I was amazed. I was shocked. It was such a new experience for me. And I recommend that series to some of you. So through the global influence, US media and cable, this gospel of prosperity has now spread throughout the world, especially in Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean. One source describes the prosperity gospel as a fundamental message that promises that in whatever measure you give financially to the church, i.e. the pastor, you will receive both spiritual and material blessings back from God. As Benny Hinn published on his website, giving is the key to breaking the back of poverty. Sow your best seed gift today and begin to expect a financial breakthrough. These ministries are often led by televangelists seeking to spread a broad net through their television shows and travel circuits. Now, this gospel has also become important within the Black church and indeed throughout the Black world, and created a new era for entrepreneurship through our locally and regionally grown pastors. In our case in Trinidad and Tobago, they're especially Afro and Indo-Trinidadian males and increasingly females. And there's also a popular program by Brazilian Afro-Brazilians, which is very strong here and throughout the region. Now, this is particularly lucrative field, as in the US and many other countries, including Trinidad and Tobago, religious institutions are tax exempt. Now, under neoliberalism, religion has assumed increased significance for many of the poor and even for the middle classes. These churches and the prosperity gospel provide hope in a dismal world, and for some, the only possibility for change through prayer, fasting, and by paying their tithes. They also provide hope and motivation to believe in oneself. It is said, whatever you believe in, that can happen, that can come to pass. Work hard, pray, and success and wealth will follow. But these churches also provide community and support with their music and dancing, and provide strength for the daily individual efforts at survival in increasingly daunting circumstances. So in Latin America and the Caribbean there have been large-scale conversions from mainstream churches, and in Trinidad and Tobago, even from non-Christian traditions, such as Hinduism and Islam. But the greatest success is actually derived by the self-appointed pastors and their families. During a changeover of currency locally, about a year ago, one Indo-Trinidadian pastor, close to the end of the period for changeover, brought to the central bank over 28 million TT dollars in cash, along with a number of unopened tithe envelopes containing cash given to him by his largely working class flock. These funds had been left unused. They had not even been counted because he had so much money that he really didn't need these funds in order to get by. On the other hand, the rise of Islam in inner city communities, not only in North America, but also in the Caribbean and certainly in Trinidad and Tobago, has also been significant. Islam, for its adherents, presents an authentic alternative to tainted Christianity, an authentic religion with a long history in Africa. The modesty of women's dress in Islam can also be perceived as a resistance against the hypersexualization of women's representation in urban Black media and in urban Black communities. So although new forms of Black Islam have also provided opportunities for economic advancement through enterprise, it has often taken a more collective rather than individualist form. Additionally, consumption tends to be less conspicuous. So in some ways, it represents some repudiation of the neoliberal paradigm. But public violence has also become an important representation of manhood and Black masculinity. In addition to the widespread gang violence, and in Trinidad and Tobago, we also have a so-called Muslim gang. Trinidad and Tobago also had the highest global per capita recruitment to ISIS during the war that took place. And virtually all, most if not all of the men who took their wives and children with them to the Middle East died during the conflict, leaving the wives and children in camps, now calling on a reluctant state to bring them home. But in addition to their willingness to be part of the global fight for an Islamic state, one local radical Islamic leader publicly admitted that the marginalization of Black youth was one of the main contributing factors to ISIS recruitment in Trinidad and Tobago, as they were told that they would be paid in US dollars, and they were also told the fixed sum that they would receive. How much more time do I have?
Yeah, you take whatever time you have. We usually end about two. Well, I'm sorry. What time is it there? 2:15 for me, so it'd be like 5:15.
So how much more time is there?
So how much time you want to take?
Okay, I'm
10.
almost finished. What I'm
Yes,
going to
sounds
just
good.
do is summarize. Now, in the rest of my paper, I look at the ways in which neoliberalism provides an environment that is conducive to intensification of race and ethnic conflict, and also, I argue, with the potential to lead to fascism. I point out that today's climate of extreme inequalities, increased migration, and the fear of deteriorating social conditions provides an environment open to new racisms of all kinds and the emergence of old ones. It also provides the context for the emergence of fascism. Poor working class men and women of all ethnicities blame sitting governments for their situation and also blame migrants, racialized groups, refugees, sexual and gender diverse people, other countries and others in general for their situation. As a result, right-wing and conservative political parties are increasingly being voted into power in the same way as Hitler was, through elections. Uh, in my next section, I look at neoliberalism and COVID-19, where I argue that COVID-19 has revealed the seamy underside of this paradigm. It has revealed the extreme social and economic dislocation that took place over the last 2 decades, and very early into the pandemic, the precarious and insecure lives of millions of the world's peoples was exposed. The weaknesses of healthcare systems, the large numbers of workers in jobs without security or benefits, the large numbers in precarious informal sector employment, many of whom now consider themselves entrepreneurs, the absence of social protection for large numbers of workers in state and private sector. Long ago, the states used to have a certain degree of security, but today they have, certainly in many parts of the world, state contracts have been shortened and benefits removed. They have also showed the vulnerability of women's specific location in the labor market, as women have been particularly affected by the lockdowns. Also, the extreme poverty and paycheck to paycheck existence of significant sectors of the global population, and the continued importance of the principle of extreme profits evident in the failure and the inequalities of global vaccine distribution. Interestingly, this situation demanded a response from states that are now weakened or unwilling to provide the kinds of support that was not required. In my country, even the private sector, supposed to be the drivers of the economy, have been demanding state support to keep them afloat. It was a shock for me to hear Boris Johnson in March 20, when I was in London, something that he has repeated against this week, that the UK would have to accept a certain number of debts. It's almost as if the virus, like the free market, would eventually work it out in the end and decide on who lives and who does not. Nevertheless, COVID-19 has provided the opportunity to begin to rethink this paradigm, which has left us exposed to the ravages of this virus. The George Floyd protests and the global reverberations are already an important legacy, and the involvement of young people, no doubt influenced by or educated in Black, Africana, and critical race theory programs on both sides of the Atlantic, through their actions, brought new anti-racist vocabularies to the fore. This is the beginning, not the end. This is not the time to stop. This pandemic has created a fissure. It's for us to push our way through. Another world is possible. Thank you.